All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into something you hear about more and more, this big critique of the West's role in the world. We're talking about the accusation of hypocrisy, and what that really means for who gets to claim the moral high ground.
So, the world is ruled by hypocrites. That quote really gets to the heart of a frustration that's just bubbling up all over the world. It's this feeling, that the gap between what powerful countries say and what they do has just gotten too big to pretend it's not there. So let's jump right into the core of this argument, and we'll start with a really stark modern example. Okay, so first up, a tale of two standards. This is all about setting up the main tension we're going to be talking about by looking at two things that just don't seem to add up when you put them next to each other.
So look at it this way. On one side, you've got Western countries using these pretty heavy-duty economic tools, like sanctions, to go after child labor in places like Uzbekistan or the DRC. And that sounds good, right? But then, on the other side, critics will immediately point to the military and diplomatic support for actions in Gaza that have resulted in huge numbers of child casualties. You see the problem? It's that exact contrast that's at the heart of this whole thing. So let's get into what people actually mean by this. What's the real accusation here when that word hypocrisy gets thrown around? We're going to break down the main charge.
At its core, it's all about this gap, right? The gap between the values that are preached, democracy, human rights, the rule of law, and what the policies actually look like when they're put into practice. And that goes for what's happening at home and what's happening abroad. And this whole system of values has a name. It's often called the rules-based order. But here's the critique. People argue that the countries who basically designed this order, well, they're the first ones to apply the rules selectively. They'll enforce them on others, but when it serves their own strategic or economic interests, they're more than willing to bend or even break those same rules.
And you see this alleged double standard pop up in two main areas. First, at home, with domestic issues like mass incarceration or the wearing away of civil liberties. But you also see it big time in foreign policy. Making strategic alliances with authoritarian governments like Saudi Arabia or Egypt. That's a tough one to square with all the talk about promoting democracy.
Now, the argument here is that this isn't just a one-off thing, a few mistakes here and there. Critics say it's a consistent pattern that goes way back. So let's look at some of the evidence they use to build that case.
Okay, a huge one that always comes up is the war on terror. After 9/11, a whole bunch of things happened, and many international law experts will tell you that those actions flew directly in the face of core principles like due process and international law.
This is where you see a real challenge to the very legal principles the West says it stands for. We're talking about the use of torture, holding people at Guantanamo Bay for decades without a trial, and launching drone strikes that killed a lot of civilians. For critics, these aren't just policies, they're a massive break from the ideals that are supposed to be the bedrock of the system.
And like I said, this goes back way before the 21st century. Just look at this timeline from the Cold War. You see a clear pattern of undermining democratic governments in Iran, in Guatemala, in Chile. And why? All in the name of strategic anti-communist goals. But the argument isn't just about military stuff. It goes deeper. The idea is that those old colonial power dynamics, well, they never really went away. They just changed their clothes and came back in a new economic form.
So think about it. You have these Western-dominated institutions, like the IMF, imposing debt and austerity. This forces cuts to really important stuff like healthcare and education in developing countries. It creates this cycle of dependency that's really hard to break. And that's exactly what critics mean when they use the term neocolonialism. It's control, but with financial and corporate power instead of armies.
Okay, let's move on to another big one, the refugee and asylum crisis. This is all about the huge gap between the idea of the West as a safe place for people fleeing persecution and the often brutal reality of its border policies. You've got policies like the EU paying countries like Turkey and Libya to basically act as gatekeepers to stop refugees from ever reaching Europe. Or you look at things like offshore detention centers or family separation policies. From the perspective of human rights groups, this isn't just a tough policy. It's a complete abandonment of the promises made under international asylum law.
But is it really that simple? The critique is powerful, for sure, but it might not be the whole story. Let's complicate things a little.
So is this critique of Western hypocrisy totally unshakable? Well, there are some pretty important counterarguments and nuances that make this picture a lot more complicated than it first seems. For one thing, the West isn't this one single thing, right? European allies disagree with the US all the time. Then you've got the internal checks and balances, things like a free press and human rights NGOs that are constantly calling out their own governments. That's a huge deal for accountability. And maybe the most interesting point, the very ideas we use to critique them, human rights, democracy, those concepts largely came from Western political thought in the first place. And that all kind of leads to the core defense, the other side of the coin. The argument goes like this. Yeah, Western countries have serious flaws and moral failures. Nobody's denying that. But they also have built-in ways to self-correct, like elections and independent courts. And that, supporters argue, is a world away from authoritarian regimes where there's zero accountability and the state itself is the source of terror.
So why does any of this matter? Why are we talking about it now? Because this isn't just some academic debate. It has real, on-the-ground consequences for everyone. Okay, let's break down the consequences. First, it just erodes trust. Faith in big international institutions like the UN takes a hit. Second, it weakens moral authority. It becomes way harder to credibly call out human rights abuses somewhere else when people can just point the finger back at you. And third, and this is a big one, it empowers rival powers. Countries like Russia and China can and do use these contradictions as fuel to promote their own, very different, illiberal models.
So the result of all this is a real crisis of legitimacy for that whole Western-led global order. I mean, no matter which side of the argument you fall on, one thing is pretty undeniable. This feeling that there's a double standard has done serious damage to trust. It's fueled anti-Western sentiment around the world and has basically put the entire global system we've known since the Cold War into question. Which brings us to the final and maybe the toughest question of all. In a world full of imperfect powers, because let's face it, they're all imperfect, what does moral leadership even look like anymore? What does it require? And who, if anyone, can actually provide it?